I'll add my good morning to Kevin's, and thanks again for inviting us all the way from Cincinnati to come share some stories and our experience with you. So as you heard from Kevin's story, he and I we come from kind of a different place. He's trained as first a journalist, and I an architect, and I think for that reason we have a lot of fun working together because we bring those different perspectives. But the other thing that I think is interesting as we kind of talked through this and started working together, we realized is whereas Kevin's training and background taught him how to tell a story and build a story, starting with the beginning and an introduction, kind of reaching a midpoint and getting to an end, what I started realizing about my own training and my own background and worldview is that it started in architecture school, where we're kind of told to just fast forward to the end. Imagine that final postcard view of a place that you're imagining, developing, and building, and suspend for a moment the kind of somewhat messy process of how a place evolves to create that postcard view that our developers or our communities that we're working with are asking us to create. One of those views is like this postcard from my hometown. I actually grew up out west. This is from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. This is an image from the 60s. And in many cases, you know, as an urbanist, we love this image. This is what we're trying to build when we're building a new place or bring back to life an old one. It's doing everything right. It's got the 3 to 4 story buildings addressing a human-scaled street. The pedestrians are walking along jammed sidewalks with bustling storefronts. The cars are where they need to be on paved streets. But what's important to realize in an image like this is that that place was not birthed as an adult. It had an infancy to it, and then it had this kind of toddler stage and this awkward adolescent stage, and continues to evolve well beyond when this image was taken. And so in reality, this didn't always look like this. The street wasn't always paved. Certainly there wasn't always cars there from a technological standpoint. The sidewalks weren't always concrete. They may have been wood at one point. The buildings certainly weren't made out of brick, and they certainly weren't 3 or 4 stories tall. And in fact, in many cases, they weren't buildings at all. This is my favorite hamburger place in that view. It started, before many of those buildings were there, as a tent intended to serve cheap hamburgers and coffee to the nearby woodworkers or mill workers that were working in the logging mill next door. And for a time, for about 5 to 10 years, they worked right out of this tent. And they were building up their savings so they one day could afford a building. But they were also finding who their customers were, what the demand was like, what did they need, what were the right price points. And while they were building up that following, they eventually got enough confidence and wind in their sails and savings to build their first building, and have since been adding to it ever since. And it's in its 120th year as a restaurant. And what we see is all up and down that Main Street, and Main Streets all over the United States and really the world, is this process of discovering demand, raising your ability and increasing your ability to meet that demand through investments in your place and in your product, and continuing to grow with the community. And kind of that cycle happened all up and down that Main Street. And one thing that we've noticed in our work experience and in our industry really is that we've interrupted that system. I mentioned before that as an architect, we're trained to imagine that last view and not all these processes that get you to that postcard view. Demand is out there, but that postcard view takes time. And so that's the crux of what we're talking about today. My story begins, as Kevin mentioned, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I moved to East Liberty neighborhood right after architecture school to take my first job. It's a neighborhood that was a lot like Walnut Hills, actually occupying the same place in Pittsburgh's history and in the state of Pennsylvania's history as the 3rd largest commercial center in that state. And over the course of urban renewal, so really through the 50s and 60s, 2,700 buildings were taken down. 12 high-rise concentration of low-income housing were built, and a one-way street was kind of built around the commercial core, effectively choking it off and trying to make it compete with the new malls that were happening out there. When I arrived there and was trying to kind of figure out what was going on, it was clear that they had turned a corner in that neighborhood and were starting to peel back the layers of malinvestment to try to bring this place back to life. And they started like many of us would. They got everybody in the church basement, and they came up with a plan, actually a pretty good plan, for how to incrementally bring this neighborhood back together. And so in the early 2000s, they started doing what at the time was kind of considered the best practice, which was kind of nibbling away at the edges of the problem areas and bringing in what they determined that the market wanted, which were big box retail in the middle of the city. So they cleared one site, 10 acres, put in the Home Depot. Cleared another site, actually reused part of another site and cleared the rest of it for the parking lot for the grocery store. And that was all working really well until what happened in 2008. The kind of music stopped and the neighborhood actually kind of got caught with its pants down because so much of that was fueled by kind of this overpowering subsidy to bring what the market was suggesting was required to bring this place back to life. What the kind of common advice was when the recession started and people were kind of hunkering down was, well, we'll just wait this out for the next business cycle to pick back up and we'll kind of restart our program. But there was a group of folks in the neighborhood led by the Community Development Corporation who said, you know, we're not going to wait. We've got momentum building. We're just going to switch our approach. And rather than working at the edges, we're going to go right at our historic core where we've had the biggest problem, but we may also have the biggest opportunity. And so we're going to go into this place that for too long had been too dark, too far over the, literally too far over the other side of the tracks, experienced no foot traffic, ton of vacancy and blight, and we're going to go right at it. And instead of subsidizing the supply, because we can't anyway, certainly not at the rates we had been to realize the grocery store and the other big box, we're going to subsidize the demand side. We're going to prove to ourselves and to the world and to Pittsburgh that this is a place that people want to come, even in the middle of the recession. So what did they do? Back up one. So this is a prominent corner. Just to give you a little context, the Burnham building is this tall tower. That's kind of the signature historic property. A lot of great architecture happening around it. And this box is right where they started. And they started with a waffle shop. That sounds kind of weird. But it wasn't just your normal waffle shop. Yeah, they sold waffles, as the picture in the upper left suggests, and it was kind of a fun environment to both make and eat waffles that were pretty okay. They weren't great. But the dining room was set up as a talk show. And it was a talk show where both the host and the guest were the people that had walked off the street expecting just to eat a waffle and then kind of carry on with their business. And they had to be strangers, so you couldn't get like two buddies up there. And not only was that entertainment for the diners, but we had a permanent camera installed in there, and it was blasting this across the universe so that anybody could kind of come in at any time and watch what the interview was happening. And this started a conversation about what was happening in that neighborhood. For the first time in generations, literally generations, people were talking to each other that had not spoken to each other for so long. We like to say that the blue-haired skater was talking to the blue-haired grandma for the first time in generations. And others started coming there. You know, they started hosting the poetry slam events and the high school held events there. And it just became where the local politicians would come and stump and that kind of thing. And all of this was done for over the course of 3 years at $75,000 a year, which sounds like a lot of money, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of money that was going to drive some of the supply-driven subsidies. And so weird things started to happen. Lights stayed on later into the night. People once again felt confident going back to that dark neighborhood in Pittsburgh, and lines started forming around the block. And while you were standing in line, people were saying, what's going on in that building? That's beautiful, I've never seen that before. What's going on in that storefront? And storefronts started slowly turning over. First as kind of bare bones uses, and then start slowly adding investment into it after that. And this is just a screenshot of a street view taken this year, or late last year rather, of that street today. This is a view where, at best, these buildings had no future. They had sat vacant for 30, 40 years, boarded up, and at worst were slated for demolition as part of the kind of ongoing revitalization efforts because the buildings were weird, didn't meet today's market needs. And what you see here is that not only were those buildings retained, but every last one of them has use in it. In particular, the Burnham building, which the city's most proud about, got market rate apartments, or mixed income apartments rather, into that building when everybody told them that that would be a moonshot. And even the new development, which you can kind of see down Center Avenue, which is this street kind of shooting away from the photo, even new development, which would have preferred to scrape all of that right edge of that image, contorted itself because they knew the value proposition that retaining those buildings in that scale of street represented. And what happened over time, and this is all in the span of about 7 years, mind you, during the recession. What happened was not only was there a kind of re-energizing of the commitment and discussion around historic preservation, but because it was creating the kind of place that people wanted to be, when Google showed up and wanted to hire hundreds of Carnegie Mellon engineers, they didn't want to be downtown. They didn't even want to be next to Carnegie Mellon. They wanted to take over the old Nabisco building in East Liberty and put their headquarters there for Pittsburgh, and have since built 3 new buildings that actually respect the scale and positioning of that initial building. And then when the Ace Hotel decided, we need our 8th location in the world, where should it be? The founder at the time, who has unfortunately since passed away, came to Pittsburgh and walked around East Liberty and said, man, there's no other place in the world I want to be but East Liberty. And so he took over the old YMCA and put in the 8th Ace Hotel there. And so, as a young architect, this really impacted me. Not only was I having a good time experiencing all this stuff, but I started using it as a way to inform how I was doing my own urban design work with developers and communities across the country. And so that was good, but I also saw that this wasn't a unique story. That all over the country, small and medium-sized innovators and entrepreneurs and communities were not sitting still waiting for supply to come. They were juicing the demand side of the equation. And so that leads us back to that coffee shop where Kevin and I met about 3 years ago now and talked about our experiences. And like all kind of planning geeks and architect geeks, we pulled out a napkin and we pulled out a pen and we said, okay, what does the process look like today, kind of conventionally speaking? On one hand, you've got the church basement and you've got the reports and you've got the studies, and you do a really good plan. You pour all your efforts into that. You ask the community to dedicate 6, 12 months to a process to hammer out the vision for what the next 15, 20 years is going to look like. Plan gets sealed, gets adopted. The implementers of the plan kind of go away and start doing all the great work that is necessary to realize the goals and initiatives in that plan. And at the other end of the spectrum, development happens, and it's usually development that is somewhere along the lines of a conversation and a compromise between what the plan said and what the development community is saying the market will actually bear. And what's a killer in that is that unless you're extremely well financed and connected, like the Over the Rhine example, and maybe some of the examples you're familiar with, is that time can go on for 2-3 years. And if there's nothing going on in that time, people begin to fear that all their work was for naught. People get frustrated that not more things are happening. And when the development happens, people aren't really connected to that development, and they are frustrated that it's not a reflection of what that unique place actually is. So we grabbed another napkin and said, okay, what's missing in this standard equation? Well, we still have planning on one side and development on the other side, which we're all working in as industry professionals at improving every step of the way. But then we inserted 2 new things that had been lost since that time where my hamburger stand was built in Coeur d'Alene. The first was this idea of juicing the demand or building the demand, showing that people have a desire and spending dollars to be in a place. And doing that through what we call activation, bringing new amenities to a place that desperately wants them but can't figure out how to get them. And then using that process kind of as your market due diligence to inform what we call the start small development. And that is where you're finding those early wins, those low risk wins that allow a place to kind of get a foothold and keep the lights on, much like the waffle shop did in Pittsburgh, so that you can begin to create an anchor around which new development comes. And if you do that, you're doing it with the community. You're doing it at a scale that's not terrifying to an average community member. And each step of the way, they're feeling connected to that process. And by the way, that building demand and smart, small stuff can happen much quicker than some of that bigger stuff. And when the bigger stuff happens, not only is it better and more market responsive because it sees what's already there, but it kind of retires this old kind of wrestling match between, does rooftops follow retail, retail follow rooftops? What we're finding is that if that amenity is not there, if you can't demonstrate to your board or to your customers or to your renters that you can walk to something, then it's very hard to have the confidence to build a place. So we believe that the retail can come in first in some small scale, and then the development comes after that. And to the extent that you're still subsidizing that supply side, that development, but you're much smarter about where and how that subsidy gets deployed. And so we started asking ourselves, what is needed to kind of scale this? How do we make sure that we can get this into the hands of as many communities as possible? And in particular, into the hands of communities, small entrepreneurs, small developers, who really are the seeds of change in all the places that we really like to visit and to live. And so we created and launched last year something called the Neighborhood Playbook. And it's available up on the upper floor here if you're interested in this. And what it was is really a two-sided book, as was described. So 2 books for the price of 1, we like to say. And it was 5 plays. One side written for entrepreneurs and developers, and the other side written for what we call everybody else. They're the same 5 plays. They intersect in the middle around growth and development. And they're written in such a way that it meets the needs that communities have and entrepreneurs have when they're pioneering in a place. And what it does is it takes what developers are already doing, or in some cases are afraid to do, and takes what communities are doing in terms of events and programming and channels it in such a way that yields the kind of outcomes they may be called for in their plan. And so even before we were done with that book, folks started coming to us and saying, we know you're working on this thing, we'd like to use it in our community. One of the first ones to do it, just to wrap up here, was actually where Kevin and I live, just across the river from Cincinnati in Bellevue, Kentucky, tiny little town, a little Main Street town. And the community knew what we were doing and kind of heard us and knew what our work was and what we were all about, and said, come save this building. This building was an old bank building that for 20 years had a social service agency in it, and they were packing up, leaving town, selling the building. And they were afraid that would go dark and that side of the Main Street would go dark. And we said, that's great, we're all for it, we're obviously vested, but let's start by zooming out. And what we realized was the building, which is somewhat in the middle of this image here, created had a parking lot, small parking lot next to it. And this was a part of town that had no real public space for people to spend time in. On top of that, this was a part of town where a lot of vacancies had started coming. It was on the wrong side of town, so it was hard to get to. And we needed to change the narrative of what it meant to be on this side of town so that people would trek all the way down there to figure it out. And then lastly, we determined that, and this is a Northern Kentucky problem, if you've been, you can maybe feel it or understand this, that we were always trying to be Ohio light, apologizing for folks that were trying to get across the river and import their dollars. And this place was all about being Kentucky forward. And so what we did is we put the playbook in the hands of 5 unsuspecting neighborhood leaders and said, get to work. And what they did was they took that small parking lot and completely reimagined it as what eventually became the Old Kentucky Makers Market. So it featured Kentucky bluegrass music, Kentucky breweries, Kentucky makers, and barbecue food. And they hosted these events monthly. We're really big onto repetition. It's a lot of work to do one big event a year. It's a little different proposition to do a smaller event but more regularly. And the important thing about doing it regularly is that people start coming back and start incorporating it into their kind of daily patterns or their monthly patterns in the summer. And hundreds of people started showing up. And this was all done through guerrilla marketing and friends of friends and things like that, and really activated that space in a really powerful way. And we had this banjo guy. Just one kind of storyline from this event. This banjo guy would kind of be our wandering minstrel and walk up and down the avenue. I mentioned it's a hard place to get to, and nobody really would trek down to where we were. He became the Pied Piper that brought people down into the space. And when they were there, he'd sit next to him, kind of strumming his banjo, and he'd be asking them questions. Where did you come from? What are you looking for? What do you think of Bellevue? Have you been to Bellevue before? And so he became our data collection tool. And we plug him into our computers and we download his brain, and he'd be kind of telling us what he was learning. And that made every event get subsequently better and more sophisticated. And so now it's entering its second year. And it's been very successful. A buyer for the building was found who was like-minded and was attracted by the kinds of things in the market demand that he saw in the Old Kentucky Makers Market. And they're entering their second year. They have a new schedule set out, and the developer is using that as a way to bring in new tenants, test them in the space, and then get them into kind of a full-time lease in one of his buildings. And so it's been successful, but that's not the end of it. What we think, kind of just thinking a little bit bigger picture here, is important about this, is that when one of those community members that didn't know what they were getting into when they picked up the book goes by that new development, and it's full, and there's a restaurant or whatever there's new residents living upstairs, they can say, I was part of that. I helped make that change happen. Or when somebody who never felt welcome at an event before, at a bar before, spent time at OKMM, and they walked past it and felt welcome to come in there and spend time there with neighbors that maybe they never got in contact before previously, they can say, oh, I remember when this event was going on. It was such a great thing. I made that change happen. And we're at a time where that's absolutely critical. The title of this conference is not Saving Buildings, although I think we all love saving buildings. It's saving places. And it's impossible for us to imagine saving places without first empowering the people that live in those places and make those places magical. And with all the things happening in kind of in terms of change and all the problems that we're forced to deal with, it can be an enormous task to imagine the future postcard view of a place. But remember that no matter how big those challenges seem, that a lot can be accomplished when you get a few people together in a space that you've taken over as a new public space, and you begin to prove to yourself and to the world that real change is possible. Thank you.